Our scripture reading this morning is from the Gospel according to Mark, which Mia just read from. I'll be reading from the second chapter, verses 1 through 5 and verse 12. When he, Jesus, returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. So many gathered around that there was no longer room for them, not even in front of the door. And he was speaking the word to them. Then some people came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. And when they could not bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and after having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And he stood up and immediately took the mat and went out before all of them, so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, for those of you who are joining us for the first time in this sermon series, yes, the sermon series is called Basecamp, thus the tents and the dramatic video that you saw just a moment ago. But the real point behind the base camp is that it's really just a metaphor for the church. The church is a base camp when we, like at the foot of a mountain, provide a place where people can come and they can seek shelter and safety. They can experience growth and learning. They can be challenged, find communities, build new friendships, be nourished. But then the point of a base camp and of a church is only to exist so that you can then go out from there to do what you're really supposed to be doing. And in the case of the church, what we're really called to be doing. This place exists so that we can come together and we can worship and we can grow and we can have fellowship and we can honor God, but then to go out from here and to push further than we have the week before, to reach people and to share with them the good news that we have experienced in Christ's salvific love for all of us. So that is the point that we are here for. Or as we say in our mission here at Grace, we say that we are here to strengthen families by making and growing highly committed Christians to be disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's what we do. That's why we're here. And the base camp is here so that the mission can be accomplished. So we've been talking about that theme about base camp, and we talked some last week about those who went before us and the vision that they had, and how the theme was to give something beautiful to God, or to create something beautiful for God. And those who have gone before us gave us this place that they have entrusted to our care. And maybe some of them are still with us today in the room. I know that this church isn't that old, so we have some of our founding members who are with us today. And what a wonderful gift that they gave. But it's also time to think about, where we go from here and about pushing out from this base camp yet again. And so with that in mind, we heard a little bit of the history from Skip and Jenna in a video last week. Today we're going to hear from Al and Karen Paul, and they're going to tell a little bit about what brought them to this church and about what excites them as we think about this special capital campaign that goes along with the base camp theme.
My name is Al Paul. This is my wife, Karen, and we've been attending Grace since 2010. We started attending Grace at that time. I was on call, running late, came down Sacred Hollow, and just decided to check the church out. And immediately I felt welcome. The people were very nice. We just had a very warm feeling, and we've been going ever since.
I came to Grace as my first Methodist church. I had been in a different denomination for many years before, and immediately I loved it. I loved the way we approached the Bible as a group. I loved the fact that I didn't have to check my intellect at the door. I could really dive into some scriptures in context and argue and wrestle with them, and even among our small groups, we would have really great discussions and no one had to have the answers. And that to me was a very growth moment for me in my faith walk and in my Bible knowledge. And it was a really huge blessing for me to be able to do that. And the other thing, coming to Grace, I just noticed immediately what a wonderful group of people there were. The family, it was like a church family that really supported each other. And then over time, I was able to be the recipient of that at times when we would have a need, or had a surgery and people brought food to me, or sent me an encouraging text when things weren't going well in situations in our family or whatever. And then gratefully, we've actually been able to participate in helping others, whether it's a mission project or a church member that needed something. So I really saw the Grace family just really love and appreciate each other and show the love of Christ to each other. And that has been such an impactful thing in my life and meant so much to both of us and our family.
Grace has been a place of spiritual nourishment and growth for me personally. And I believe the Basecamp program is important because at last we're on the threshold of being able to retire the debt, and the money we're paying interest could definitely be used for more important things, particularly since it seems like inflation's here to stay, costs are going to go up, and I think it's important to retire the debt as we're able to do it.
And when I think about it, it just gives me so much excitement to think about paying off this beautiful church property and this beautiful facility. What we can do with that money, helping others and really just living out being Jesus followers is so exciting to me. And I really, really feel like we can retire this debt. And I'm excited about it. I'm excited about what the opportunities will be brought to this church based on retiring the debt. So I really hope that everyone will get on board with Basecamp and support this opportunity.
Thank you, Al and Karen. In 1953, there was a British group of climbers joined by a New Zealander who set out to do what many people had tried to do unsuccessfully before, and that was, of course, to try to reach the summit of the world's highest peak, Mount Everest. That particular team met some challenges, their first few attempts to try to get to the summit, and then finally it was the day that it was the turn for, they're going to try another leader in the group to try to reach the top. This time it was the New Zealander's turn, and his name is Edmund Hillary. Hillary, you may recognize his name, of course, because he was the first person to reach the top of Mount Everest. He worked his way up to the summit, and when he finally got to the top, he, I think, was wowed by the whole experience. What an incredible feat, something that had never been done in the history of humankind. He bowed and he placed a crucifix at the top of the mountain. He stayed up there for 15 minutes taking pictures and taking in the view, and then he had to leave again because the air is so thin up there that you just can't hang out up there for very long. And he made his descent. And from that day on, he was the most famous alpinist in the whole world. He wrote books, had all kinds of speaking engagements, was knighted. He was a big deal, and he only died a few short years ago. But his name is going to be forever in the history books and the record books as being the first person to reach the summit of Mount Everest. Now, there are hundreds of people who have done it since, but when you think about the number of climbers the world over, only a handful reach the summit every year. As we talked about before, there's 2 months that it takes roughly to go up and down from the top to the bottom again. It costs tens of thousands of dollars. And you have to just get lucky, really, too, in terms of your own stamina, strength, lung capacity, and the weather has to hold. And you have to get a permit to do it. So it's still an elite feat. But one of the things that didn't get talked about enough when Edmund Hillary reached the summit was the other part of that climbing expedition, the other part of a duo, which was his Sherpa, a man named Tenzing Norgay. You might have seen his name on the quote in that video, the intro video. Norgay is a Sherpa, which means that not only is he somebody who is a guide and an assistant to climbers, but the Sherpa are actually a very small ethnic group that have spent generations now in the Himalayas. And so that is their native terrain. That is their homeland. That is a part of their story. And now for many, many years, people in the Sherpa community have made a living aiding hikers in their attempt to go higher and higher up the mountain. The funny thing is that Norgay was probably just as much a part of reaching the peak, if not more so than Edmund Hillary. Norgay was the one who was responsible for charting much of the course. He carried a significant amount of the gear. The climbers at that time, and still today, depended on the local knowledge and expertise of the Sherpa community to help them reach their goals and to get to the summit. In other words, if there was no Tenzing Norgay, there was no Sherpa, there would be no Edmund Hillary in the history books. There would be no first person on Mount Everest coming from the Western world. And so this is an important part of the story, and I don't think it gets told enough, although in recent years, more and more of Norgay's story has come out and he has received some of the recognition that he is due. But it's also been interesting to see that he didn't even ever feel like it needed to be about him. He was okay sort of being the assistant that helped somebody else get him there. It makes me think about those people who play that role in our lives. The mentors, the coaches, the parents, the Sunday school teachers, the grandparents, those figures that help us get to where our potential is or where they see us wanting to go. And they're more than happy to do all that they can to support us in getting there and then stepping back at the moment that we can step into the spotlight. It's a powerful part to play, and it comes to mind as reading that wonderful story from Mark. You know, Mia did such a good job with the kids talking about the role of the friends, and quite honestly, if you read that story as a Christian, many of us will say, well, Jesus performed another miracle, and that's pretty special. Yeah, let's not downplay that at all. But that's probably not the part of the story that hangs on for us. It's not the part that really clicks, right? We hear that story and we think about a man who is paralyzed and he's made well again and he's able to walk. That's incredible. That's a story of healing. That's a story of Jesus' power. That's a story of faith. It's also the story about the people who were packing in around this tiny little stone or mud house that Jesus was in the village of Capernaum. And he's there, and the crowd is so thick that people can't even get within earshot of what Jesus is doing. But the real part of this story that I think we all take away is the story of the friends. Now, we don't know. There may have been a set of stairs that went around the back of the house and went up to the rooftop. It might have been some guys leaned a log up against the house, tried to get up of it. Maybe it was a low enough ceiling. They pulled themselves up onto it. But they got their friend up, hoisted onto the roof. And the part of the story, if I'm really allowing myself to be immersed in the story and imagine being there, just think about some of the circumstances. We got a house. It's probably not very tall, flat roof, a couple bedroom house. The rooftops would have been flat because generally sometimes people would go up there and they'd dry clothes, they'd bathe up there sometimes. So it wasn't uncommon to have a flat roof, but they get up there and they need to get their friend down in. But they didn't bring shovels. They didn't bring a pick. All they have is their hands, probably. And out of the importance and the immediate need to help their friend, they start to claw away at the rooftop, digging ferociously until there is a hole big enough that they can start peeling back larger chunks. And they look down and they see Jesus in there, and they lower their friend down on a mat to Jesus. And Jesus tells the man that his faith has made him well, get up and walk. But I also can't help but think that Jesus cast a glance up at the friends and reminded them that it was part of their faith that had made this man well too. Because without them, without the spiritual Sherpas in place, I'm not sure this man would have been able to be in the presence of Jesus. So we have these spiritual Sherpas in our lives. We have this story. Today, there is in the village of Capernaum, which has been excavated, and there's all kinds of digs that have been done there. They've uncovered a synagogue and the foundations of a synagogue from Jesus' time. They found some dwellings, and they found the house that they believe that Jesus was in this story because they think it was where Peter's mother lived. And the reason they think that is because they have found little tiny crosses chiseled into the walls like ancient graffiti that have been there from almost the time of Constantine, which tells us that pilgrims have been going to that spot And local lore and legend said that was the house where this took place. And so people have continued to flock for the past 2,000 years to find the house where this miracle took place. And we got a picture of what that actually looks like today. So this is part of the village of Capernaum. It's not that big. It's not a whole lot bigger than what you see in this picture. Behind us is the synagogue. To the right of us is a wine press and a parking lot. And this is about it. Now, this spaceship-looking thing over these ruins is a Catholic church. And the significant thing is if you go in on the right-hand side, you can barely see it, but there's a set of steps going up into the church from the ground floor. And when you go in there, the significant part of this is it's built over the top of this home, and there's a glass floor in the sanctuary. So as you are worshiping, you can look down and you can see not just inside the house, but you see the perspective that the friends had as they lowered their loved one down to see Jesus. These spiritual Sherpas play a massive role. And they're a part of our story, and they're a part of our church's story. When I think back to the people who just over 20 years ago had a vision in this community to plant a church here that started meeting in homes, and then it started meeting in the elementary school. And it met at another shop for a little while, a restaurant, and then it finally ended up that the folks at the time decided that they wanted to acquire some land. And so they bought this land. It was meant to be a wooded, serene place, as you heard Jenna talk about last week, a place in the woods for worship, creating something beautiful for God. And here they built this place. And I can't imagine the joy that they had about 15, 17 years ago when they came in here and they opened the doors for the first time, the first Sunday in December, which is probably the second Sunday of Advent that year. They flung the doors open. Everybody walked into the brand new building for the first time. And how proud they must have felt of what they were able to do together. And they built something beautiful for God. But not just that. The idea that this would be a vision as a base camp, but of course they didn't use that metaphor at the time, but the idea that this was going to be something that would be a lasting part of this community, a place where we could come to and gather and worship and learn and grow and then go out to serve and to share the good news of the gospel of Jesus. Now today, we have before us this campaign, this special capital campaign, actually two. One campaign is for 2023, and that's our gifts of our regular tithes and offerings, the commitments that we will make to supporting the ministries in the coming year. But the other one is the Basecamp campaign, this special capital campaign, which is largely about paying off the debt of this building, going from $8.5 million down to $1.2 million today. We're so close, we're almost there. But I realize, and I'm just going to be frank, I realize that for many people, a debt reduction campaign, or primarily a debt reduction campaign, isn't as exciting as building a brand new building. It's not as exciting as crossing the threshold of a church that's paid for as it is to cross the threshold of a church that's the first time you've ever been in the building and it's a brand new structure. I get that. But what this also means is that this is the time for us not to be the ones who reach the summit first, but to be the supporting cast, to be the spiritual Sherpas now, to say, we don't necessarily need the spotlight of the day that the church was opened, but we want to be the people who support the ministries now going forward. We believe in the ministries and what we are capable of, and that this church has a place in this community for years to come, generations to come. And we want to be those people who may not get to see all of the glory that is down the road, but we want to be a part of the story and enable that to happen. We want to play that supporting role. We want to be the Sherpa. We want to shoulder some of that burden, financial burden in this case, to make that possible. It reminds me of the story of Moses. He's with the Israelites as they have gone out of Egypt. They've gone into the Sinai. They have spent those 40 years in the wilderness. And then finally, God takes him up to the mountain and he says, I want you to look over the Jordan River and into the valley below. And what you're going to see, that is the promised land. That is where I've told you we are going. That is what we've been working for a generation now. But you're not going to get to go there yourself. You've reached the end of your journey. You have Sherpa'd your people here, and now they're going to get to take the step into the promised land. But your story is equally important because you have worked to make this possible. And part of playing that role of Sherpa means that we may never get to see everything that is to come, but we can trust knowing that God continues to be at work. Now, because this is not the end of the line for us, I pray, in our lives, right? We will get to see some of it, but we can only imagine what God will do through the ministries of this church years down the road, a generation or two from now. A few years ago, Eleanor and I were on a little day tour of the city of Savannah, Georgia. We had never been there before, heard wonderful things about this charming little town. It's great. Parks and fountains and cool buildings and restaurants and neat mansions to tour and all that, right? Very cool place. We get to the end of our tour. We've checked off all the things on our itinerary because that's how we travel. And we get to the spot where we're looking at this church. It's kind of a nondescript church. You got a picture of it. It appeared to us at the edge of a park. Looked at the church, and it had one of those historical marker signs outside, which are kind of everywhere in a town like Savannah. But we stopped and we paused to read it. What was the story with this church? And the church is called First African Baptist Church. And the sign said, oldest African American congregation in North America. Somebody popped out of that little door underneath the steeple and said, hey, would you folks like a tour? We're starting one in 20 minutes. Just hang out here if you want to be a part of the tour. We said, sure. We went on a tour, totally not on our itinerary, and I am so glad we did because it was the most amazing thing we saw all day. We start the tour, and they take us up into the sanctuary, and they show us these old wooden benches. And they said these were the original pews of the church. But the church has a rich history beyond just being old. It said, in the city of Savannah, during the time of slavery, there was a unique law that wasn't in all parts of the South. This law allowed enslaved peoples at the end of their workday, typically in the fields, to take on another job. And this second job would be one that they could be paid for. So many of these enslaved peoples, they began to take on these second jobs, and with the money that they were able to build up, they decided that they wanted to build a church. So they purchased the building supplies, and then, after they had had enough of the supplies in stock, they then began to work on the structure of the church, but they couldn't do it during the daytime because they were enslaved. So at night, by torchlight and candlelight, they slowly began to construct this church. And it took them many years, but finally they were able to do it. And they had a church all of their own that they had paid for with their own money, with their second jobs, building at night in the darkness. And finally this place was completed and it was theirs. And the year was 1777. Just awesome. So they walk us in and they show us this sanctuary that they're still showing visitors with pride today. And they showed us those benches and they said, I want you to notice that there's not a nail in those benches. They couldn't afford nails. So they made all the nails out of wood, and the wooden nails that they made still hold these benches intact today. And we've only got one of them up here because the rest of them we keep downstairs. Then they showed us a tour of the sanctuary floor. We said, what's with the floor? They said, look closely at it. And as we looked, we saw these patterns all over the floor in the wood. That's one of the support columns that holds up the balcony today over there on the right side of the picture. But on the floor is this thing. It looks like a kite. And they said, this is an ancient African symbol. And enslaved Africans from various different tribes and communities would have recognized that as a symbol in our church and known that they were welcomed here. And it's kind of a crude carving, if you will, but each of those holes is about the size of a marble. And if you look at them from the right angle, you can see that they're drilled at a bit of an angle, and they go all the way through the floorboards. We didn't know what that was about until we finished the tour in the lower level underneath the sanctuary in a basement. It was an area with a low ceiling, as I recall. And as he looked up, I saw that all of those kite or diamond patterns in the floor above had light coming down into the basement. And they said, yes, those are ancient African symbols, but there were also ventilation holes so that air could circulate down here in the lower level. Because within a matter of a few decades, this church became a stop on the Underground Railroad. Enslaved African peoples building their own church with their own money, with their own hands, and then it became a stop on the Underground Railroad. But here's the part that almost made me tear up. They said, okay, that concludes our tour because now we continue with the ministry that we do for our community. And they opened the doors, and in come all of these people who have been living on the streets. And they file in and they sit at tables, sitting on those original pews. These 300-year-old pews where they still sit and they receive a community meal every day for lunch. I can't imagine the joy that those folks must have had when they opened that church that they had built, that they had paid for, and that they were free to worship in. And I can't imagine that the joy that they had knowing that they were helping enslaved siblings make their way to freedom through the Underground Railroad. But I also believe that they had no idea when they crafted those benches or built that building or drew those ventilation holes that 250 some years later, that they would continue to serve and minister to their community by providing a warm meal and a place to seek refuge from the heat or the cold of the day. Every one of them, spiritual Sherpas. That's why when we think about and pray about and have a conversation at home about how are we going to respond to paving the way for what is to come for this church and this community, we really have no idea of what God will continue to do through God's people that are part of a congregation called Grace. And we don't put limits on what God is able to do. But when we take on that role of being builders, of being providers, of being spiritual Sherpas, and be willing to say, this may not be the most engaging period of capital campaign in this church's history, we still have something mighty and powerful that we are capable of doing, because when we pay this building off, when we pay off these lands, we free up additional resources to be the spiritual Sherpas for the community that we haven't been able to do because we have been encumbered by this debt. So we'll finish this final chapter, we'll write these final checks, we'll be done with this, and we will continue to write the next chapter of where God is calling Grace. Let us take seriously and embrace that role of the Sherpa. Let us recognize that maybe when we take a step back, someone else might be able to take a step forward. And I invite you to be in prayerful discernment this week about how you will respond. A pledge card will arrive tomorrow in the mail. Another one will arrive on Tuesday for the 2 different campaigns. But next Sunday, when we gather in this place, we will break bread for communion. We will worship the living God. We will come together with our pledge cards and lay them at the altar. Then we will provide a service project for those in need. And then we will break bread and we will share a meal together before we push out once again from our base camp to be the Christ followers that we have been called, challenged, and invited to be by our resurrected Lord and Savior. Let us pray.